So here's a nice little visual from our BC Ministry of Education. IEP should include baseline assessment and collaborative planning and writing of the document. It should include implementation of the strategies and monitoring to make sure that they are being implemented with fidelity and bringing about the results that are intended, and then reviewing and reporting on those results. And that this should be happening frequently, not just annually. So let's talk a bit about baseline assessment. This serves two purposes. So one, baseline provides information on the current performance necessary to develop goals. You can't come up with a meaningful goal if you don't know what the student is currently doing, right? So what should Johnny be doing in terms of literacy in grade 2? Well, the first question is, well, what can Johnny currently do in terms of literacy? And then what's the next evolution in his learning, right? Whether it's at the grade 2 level or below, I need to know what he's currently doing before I can tell you what the next step should be. Two, ongoing performance monitoring. Provides information on the effectiveness of instruction and IEP instructional strategies. So if you have, you need your baseline data to tell you where you're gonna go. And then similarly in the future, you need that baseline data to refer back to tell you how far you've come, right? I can't just ask you, how are things going if I'm not comparing it to a standard? Relative to what? How are things going? So punchline, you can't know something is working or effective if you can't compare it to baseline. This is part of being a scientist practitioner. In science, you evaluate the effectiveness of something in comparison to baseline. Here's what was happening before we did anything, and now that we did something, we see an improvement, and we compare those two. That's a scientific analysis. As scientist clinicians, we should be aiming for that. So is it getting better? Right? If we sit around the meeting at Christmas or at the end of the year and say, recess, is it better? Recess compared to what? What's the baseline we're comparing to? So let me show you some examples. The number of times putting up hand in class during the first 3 weeks of September 2016. So these were the daily totals. The number of times our target student was putting up her hand. And then there's the treatment data. The strategies were a prompt card on her desk that reminded her to put up her hand, and a token system that reinforced her when she did put up her hand. The teacher delivered a token, as opposed to just acknowledging her, maybe not, and moving on. And so you can see that compared to baseline, it's not like she wasn't doing anything, maybe better than some students. There was a tremendous improvement. And what would the answer be if I said, is it getting better without the baseline data? Well, without the baseline data, I'd be thinking about this data right here. Well, compared to where we started, it seems to be a bit better, right? I'm comparing these 3 data points to like the first couple days where she wasn't putting up her hand at all. And I'm giving you this anecdote, well, it seems to be a bit better. She's putting up her hand a little bit, right? But that's not as useful as if you have baseline in the treatment where you can say, wow, I mean, she was doing a little bit, but now look, all of the data points are way above where her baseline was. She's really putting up her hand and participating a lot. And actually, if you connect the dots, you see that this is an increasing trend. Not only is she doing more than baseline, she's increasing her hand putting up behavior, right? That's the advantage of having data in an IEP, so that the answers to our questions, how are things going, should not be orally delivered. They should be graphs, right? I should be able to show you some data that answers your question, right? Something on a page should answer it better than my anecdote about how I think the hand raising is going. What if this was the baseline data? Right? You've got 10, 20 times a day. Do you need an IEP objective for putting up hand? No, that's the other reason for taking baseline data, is because every now and then it shows that actually this isn't a good goal because the student's actually doing way better than you thought. Right? In this case, the teacher might be saying, oh, no, we don't need a goal about putting up her hand more. She's putting up her hand more than most of the other kids in class. Actually need to keep her hand down a little bit. Right? It's more than 20 times a day, her hand just keeps shooting up. This is not a problem. Right? But we wouldn't know that if we didn't have this baseline data, or at least the teacher there to tell us that. So baseline data is important, and it is actually, according to our ministry, what should be part of an IEP. So how do you assess it? Well, you've got this nice little acronym RIOT, which is review records. I can go back and do file review. I can do interview of last year's teacher, special education assistant, the parents, others. I can go and put eyes on and observe, or in some cases I can test. So let's break these things down. So reviewing, understanding a student's needs can be informed by reading various records with both current and historical information. And this has a role, there's a place. I think primarily I would review records if it was someone new to me. I don't know this student and I need to read the reports of others. Once a student has been in school for a period of time, then this becomes less of an issue, right? You don't need to go and read last year's report, you can go talk to last year's teacher. So permanent records, special services files, Where I think this does actually apply quite nicely is when a kid moves into high school. Their big file's going to go with them, and there's probably a lot of good information there from the last couple of years that's beneficial. Teacher, learning support notes, any classroom marks. This could even be a report card. I could look at a report card to have a rough sense of how a student is doing. And performance logs or maybe other instructional data. If they actually have some data being collected on last year's IEP, then I could look at that data to have an empirical answer to how are these things going. So there's looking at documentation. It has a place. I think the other three are more applicable most often. Interviewing, obtain information by talking to people. So Dr. Mom and Dr. Dad, right? Parents have so much information about their kids, and we should be exploiting their resources and their vast knowledge about their child. We should be asking them, and that's simultaneously going to address that issue of being included and consulted with what's happening in the schools, right? Showing that they're valued by being asked and included. I can talk to last year's teacher. I might talk to the speech pathologist, the behavior analyst who's working with them. I can sometimes talk to the student. In some cases, you could talk to peers of the student to find out how things are going. For example, if I do some work in high schools, and high schools are very complicated social settings. It's very easy to be weird in a high school. It's very easy to be stigmatizing. Look, we're trying to help a kid in social situations in high school because high school kids don't want the adults around. And so in some cases, if we want to know how a kid is doing, like in the locker room before gym, we might actually pick a few students to come out that we've selected and ask, can you tell us how Johnny's doing? Is anyone making fun of him? Is he doing the right thing? Is there anything that we might do to help? Right? Asking other kids sometimes is applicable. So there's your interviewing. Observing. Get eyes on the student, direct observation. As a behavior analyst, I like eyes on. I like to verify for myself. Because I might ask someone a question and get their very honest interpretation, and then I go in and observe, expecting to see what I heard, and what I see is actually quite different, right? So it's important to have eyes on. There's some data that shows that informant data isn't actually that reliable, including from parents who have the most altruistic of intentions, right? Parents are not lying about what they report about their kids, but when you go and objectively observe as a professional, you tend to see things very differently because there's a difference in perspectives of how you're answering that question. So interviewing is important, and we take everyone's word at face value, but then we also need to see what's happening live. So eyes on can be checklists and rating scales. I can get an SEA to take some data, how many times he goes to the bathroom, how many times he does this, how many problem behaviors, etc. Work products or portfolios, if they need help with fine motor skills and arts and coloring, cutting, gluing, pasting, get them to do some of those activities and let's see the permanent product. Do we need to work on this kid's coloring? Well, let's see a portfolio of what he's colored recently and compare it to where the other kids are if we decide, before deciding that we need to work on coloring. Video samples. In some cases, we can't capture by going up, but by being there live, but we can get a video recording of recess or a gym class, or in some cases, classrooms. And then, of course, we'll talk about tomorrow is functional behavior assessment to address problem behavior. So the big thing about observing as part of RIOT or getting your baseline information is, to me, it really requires observation time. How many LSTs have all this extra time in their caseloads where before every IEP, they can go in and spend a whole day shadowing a kid? And I see all these people shaking their heads. It's not in your job description. It's not built into the time you have available. So that's a barrier, right? Ideally, you'd like to have the time to go in and see the classroom, see the context, so that you can speak from that informed perspective when you're at the IEP meeting. But I understand it's really not built in. As a consultant who goes in on the parents' dime, I often have that luxury, and that's where I often work together with the LST. The LST can't go in and do that, so I'll go in and do a classroom visit prior to the IEP and then share that information with the parent and the LST and get some of this information before we have the IEP meeting, right? But that doesn't happen for every student. It can't happen for every student. So there are some real systems barriers here, right? This isn't a criticism of any one individual's practice. This is a reality of our education system needs more funding. Right? Smaller caseloads, so that people would have the time to go and do these best practice things, get eyes on. And then you have testing, which can take a variety of different forms, formal and informal. So you can do probes, like you've got a particular target behavior, and we say, we're just going to check on it every Friday for a few weeks to see if he's doing this particular thing, right? Is he keeping his desk organized? Well, once a week, we're going to go and take a look, a time sample. That's a probe. A criterion reference test where we compare kids to themselves and their progress. So a lot of kids coming in who've had home-based ABA programs have been following ABA curriculum like the ABLES or the VB map, those are criterion reference tests. That's a whole other workshop learning about those. But they have a map of what the kid has, student has achieved and what the next thing is, and you can see their progress relative to their past performance. Curriculum-based measurement is really important. There's a great graduate course in special education at UBC on curriculum-based measurement, where you assess how the child is doing compared to their peers, and you design interventions that are sensitive to change, and they're huge in literacy and numeracy. So the most commonly used that I see for literacy is the DIBBLs, the Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills. How many of you know and use the DIBBLs? A bunch of you. It's one example of a curriculum-based measure where I assess what are you currently doing. I can compare that to a grade level, and then I can repeat that test and repeat that test to show that you are improving over time. It's a wonderful, simple resource for oral reading fluency and some phonics skills in the early grades. For numeracy, a great thing to do, we sometimes have these questions with kids in particular who have really kind of up and down skill profiles, like they're really strong in other areas, and then you might overestimate that they're not as strong in other areas. And math is often one of these. I'm really not clear on how he is at math. So a curriculum-based measure here would be, you have the teacher, if say we're in grade 3 and we're doing multiplication, you have the teacher make a 20-question generic grade 3 middle-of-the-road multiplication quiz, deliver it to the entire grade 3 class, and then have our student do that same quiz and see is he in the ballpark with the other kids or not. And if he's way below, then that gives us some information. If he's in the ballpark, that's useful information as well, right? So that's a bit less formal. And then you've got your norm reference test, which school psychologists would do, and these tend not to be used very much in the practices that I see. You've got the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive achievement assessments and a variety of other formal psychoed academic achievement tests. And the thing about these is they're actually only designed to be done once a year. They're not done for repeated measures. So if I test you now, it's not designed for me to retest you until next year. They're not sensitive to small changes. It's like an IQ test. If you did an IQ test every year, you shouldn't expect to see massive changes. IQ tests are not sensitive to incremental change. That's why typically they're recommended, they're at the time of diagnosis. We often recommend full psych ed batteries around grade 3, middle of elementary as you move into upper level, grade 7 as you move into high school, and then at the end of high school, right? You kind of divide those psychoeds through the school career. And then there's others. An AAC example here, I was working with a really interesting kid a couple of years ago where he does not speak at all. He's never spoken a word in his life, but he understands a tremendous amount. We don't know how much he understands, and he is a genuine independent typist. You give this kid Proloquo to go and an iPad, and he will type incredible things. But if you try and vocally interact with him, most you'll get is a grunt. And so it's really difficult to assess his literacy because most literacy requires reading out loud and answering comprehension quizzes, and he couldn't do any of this. So it was hard to place him and where is his literacy and what would be a reasonable goal based on where he is. And we worked really closely with a speech pathologist, she and I, to come up with strange and creative ways to get a rough idea of where he is. This is not an evidence-based practice. We're literally making it up to have some semblance of where his literacy is so that we can have that as a baseline and then set a goal based on that. So in some cases, we get really creative and just try and solve our own problems.